You may be seeing the name Karen Read popping up in the news, and that is because she is on trial for the second time for the 2022 murder of her boyfriend, John O'Keefe. So here's an overview of everything you need to know about the first trial, the case, and what is currently going on. Karen Read of Massachusetts was accused of intentionally backing her car into her boyfriend, a Boston police officer, and then leaving him to die in the snow outside of a house party in 2022. She went to trial last year, pleading not guilty to second-degree murder, but after a jury could not agree to a verdict, the judge declared a mistrial. And now that retrial is taking place. On January 28, 2022, Karen Read and her boyfriend, John O'Keefe, had been out drinking with friends in Canton, Massachusetts, a town about 20 miles south of Boston. They were at a bar when they ran into another police officer, Brian Albert, and were invited to a late-night party at his house. Shortly after midnight, they drove to the house where O'Keefe got out of Read's black Lexus SUV. And what happened between then and the following morning is what has been questioned throughout the trial. Around 5:00 a.m. on January 29th, Karen Read allegedly found John O'Keefe unresponsive in the snow outside of the house. Read claims she had frantically searched for him after waking up on his couch around 4 a.m. and realizing that he had not come home from the party. John O'Keefe had severe head injuries and hypothermia, causing his death. Karen Read was arrested 3 days later on charges of second-degree murder and manslaughter. But she has maintained her innocence, with her defense alleging that she is the victim of a large-scale cover-up within the Boston Police Department. Prosecutors allege that Karen Read and O'Keefe were fighting before she drove him to the house in Canton. They claim that Read accelerated in reverse, intentionally striking him before leaving him in the snow. Evidence that prosecutors have include damage to the rear end of Karen's SUV and pieces of red taillight found outside the house. There are also quote-unquote enraged voicemail messages left on John O'Keefe's phone from that night. And they have statements from witnesses who allege that O'Keefe had told Read that he wanted to end their relationship. Additionally, some of the emergency workers called to the scene that morning testified that they heard Karen repeatedly saying, "I hit him." But Read said that in her shock and grief that morning, she was asking a panicked question, "Did I hit him?" not confessing, "I hit him." Karen Read's defense claims that she is being blamed as a result of a cover-up by the partygoers. So the defense says that Read dropped John off at the party in Canton, where someone inside fatally beat him and then dumped his body in the snow. They say that John O'Keefe appeared to have been ambushed, beaten, and bitten by a dog. The Alberts had a German Shepherd, and then left outside in the snow. And defense witnesses testified that John O'Keefe's injuries were not consistent with being hit by a car. According to prosecutors, vehicle data from Read's SUV showed that at 12:45 a.m., while outside Brian Albert's home, her Lexus traveled backwards for 60 feet at 24 miles an hour. The SUV's taillight was broken, and pieces of the light were later found outside of Brian Albert's home. Forensic testing reportedly showed that John O'Keefe's hair was found on the vehicle's bumper, and his DNA was found on the taillight. Investigators also found remnants of a cocktail that appeared to have been spilled on the bumper, and O'Keefe was seen leaving the bar with a cocktail in his hand. And additionally, bits of what was described as drinking glass were found in the SUV's bumper. To the defense, Karen Read's broken taillight came from leaving her home in a panic after discovering in the early morning hours of January 29th that her boyfriend had never come home. Security camera from O'Keefe's home showed that she backed into his car in his driveway. And her defense attorney added that authorities did not find the pieces of taillight during an initial search of the Alberts' yard. They found them later in the day after Karen Read's car had already been seized. So this emphasizes the defense's theory that this whole thing against Karen Read was an elaborate cover-up. The defense blamed authorities for failing to carry out a real investigation because of close connections to Brian Albert and his family. Albert is a police officer, as is his brother, and they say that because of all of these connections, authorities just focused on Read instead of doing a proper investigation. And the defense alleges that the lead investigator in the case, Massachusetts State Police Trooper Michael Proctor, was the main reason that the investigation was handled improperly. Earlier this week, Proctor testified and acknowledged that he had referred to Read using derogatory language in text messages with other troopers. Proctor was actually suspended without pay 7 days after the judge declared a mistrial, after evidence about his inappropriate behavior came to light during the first trial. So in one instance, Proctor described Read using an offensive term, and told troopers in a text, including 2 supervisors, that he hadn't found any nude photos of Reed while searching her phone. Earlier this week, he described the comments as regrettable and unprofessional jokes that did not obscure his ability to carry out an impartial investigation. But there is more. The defense also pointed to what attorney David Yannetti described as 2 curious phone calls between Brian Albert, the homeowner, and Brian Higgins, a friend and agent with the Bureau of Alcohol, Tobacco, Firearms, and Explosives. Higgins had also been at the bar and after party that night, and the calls from Albert to Higgins were made at 2:22 a.m. on January 29th after the party at Albert's house. The initial phone call lasted 1 second, and Albert testified that it was accidental. And he said he did not respond to a returned call that lasted 22 seconds. Higgins testified that he had no recollection of answering the phone call or calling anyone back. Higgins also testified that he and Karen Reed had become attracted to each other in the months before O'Keefe's death and had exchanged flirtatious texts. When the defense asked Higgins on the stand if he had become frustrated that Karen had ghosted him in the days before the party and paid no attention to him at the bar, Higgins said no, not at all. But the defense continued to maintain that this could have been a motive. And then we have Jennifer McCabe, Brian Albert's sister-in-law, who had also been at the bar and after party. She was also one of the 2 women who had gone looking for John O'Keefe with Karen Reed in the early morning hours. McCabe initially told a grand jury that she heard Karen Reed wonder if she could have hit her boyfriend, saying, "Did I hit him?" But then at the trial, McCabe described Reed's reaction as a statement, "I hit him," and she said that Reed declared this to a paramedic who asked what happened to John O'Keefe. When asked about this on the stand, McCabe rejected the idea that she had manufactured a story for the jury. Next, we have the Google search. There was a Google search conducted in the early morning hours for "how long to die in cold," with how spelled incorrectly. Forensic examination showed that McCabe made this search at 2:27 a.m. on January 29th, several hours before O'Keefe's body was found, and it showed that she deleted the search after. But on the stand, McCabe denied searching for the phrase at that time. She said that around 2 a.m. she had been making another search on her phone related to a basketball team her daughter was invited to. And then she made the search for hypothermia hours later after John O'Keefe was found. Prosecutors say that the query was made between 6 a.m. and 6:30 a.m. as Karen Reed's frantic requests just after she discovered her boyfriend unresponsive. And an expert witness for the prosecution testified that the phrase was typed into a search tab that had been left open since 2:30 a.m., resulting in misleading timestamps. But the defense pointed to this being a search that was made after John O'Keefe was beaten inside the home. Karen Reed was charged with first-degree murder, manslaughter while operating a motor vehicle under the influence, and leaving the scene of a fatal accident, and she pleaded not guilty. Her initial trial lasted 9 weeks, with 70 witnesses testifying and more than 600 pieces of evidence evaluated. And after 5 days of deliberation, the jury was unable to reach a verdict and a mistrial was declared. After the fact, 4 jurors revealed that the jury had actually reached a unanimous verdict to acquit Karen Reed on the charges of second-degree murder and leaving the scene of a fatal accident. Because of this, Reed's attorneys have asked multiple appeals courts and now the Supreme Court to dismiss those charges, arguing that they would be double jeopardy because she was acquitted on those charges according to the 4 jurors. But these requests, due to the double jeopardy claims, have been denied by all of the courts, and they now sit in the hands of the Supreme Court, who has no timeline on when they have to respond to this. So Karen Reed's retrial is continuing. Jury selection has been slow going. The process was expected to take 2 weeks. 10 jurors were seated in the first week, but so far this week it has been very slow to seat more jurors. We will see if the actual trial starts next week and what different evidence, if any, the prosecution and or the defense brings into the trial. But Reed is continuing to maintain her innocence. Many people do believe she is innocent, but there are also many who believe that she is guilty. Let me know what you think because I'm very curious. I don't think there's enough evidence to convict her, at least from what we saw in the first trial, but I'm also not 100% convinced that she is not guilty. I believe it possibly could have been an accident, but I also could see the cover-up story being true. So I'm very curious to see what comes out in this trial, and I'd love to hear what you think. But that is an overview of the Karen Reed case, the trial, and everything that has happened so far in this second trial.